Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Stained Glass Museum's autumn webinar series for 2021. It's a pleasure to be back. We last had our online talks in spring this year, and the time has passed very quickly, but we're delighted to have another great series lined up for you this autumn. While people are joining, I should say my name is Jasmine Allen. I'm the director and curator of the Stained Glass Museum. And I will be hosting this series of lectures. One of the advantages to moving our events online is, of course, being able to reach you in your homes and to host speakers from further afield with more ease. But it is my pleasure this evening to welcome and introduce Suzanne Phillips. Suzanne, please come back so that we can see you and turn your video on. Welcome. We're delighted to welcome Suzanne this evening. I know Suzanne well and have done for many years now. She's currently a trustee of the Stained Glass Museum, and we're delighted to have her on board. Prior to that, she was master of the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass in 2019 to 20, which was a difficult year to say the least, during which Suzanne pioneered the Glaziers through a world of online events and actually helped us learn the ropes too. So Suzanne, we have a lot to thank you for. But tonight Suzanne is speaking to us in another role of hers, because she is also a researcher currently studying for a PhD in the history of art at the University of Buckingham. And she's a member of the Georgian group and still very much involved in the Glaziers company, where she's a trustee of the Glaziers Foundation and also former chair of the Craft and Competitions Committee there. So tonight, Suzanne is going to speak to us about the life and work of Georgian glass painter Francis Eginton, who she has carried out fairly extensive research on, and I think was also the subject of her master's dissertation completed not so long ago. So Suzanne, we're really delighted to have you speak to us about this quite little known figure, but a very important figure in Georgian glass painting. So over to you.
Jasmine, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I should give you a bit of news. I'm no longer a trustee of the Glaziers Foundation. That ended when I stopped being master. So my loyalties at the moment, I think, as a trustee are very much with the Stained Glass Museum. But here we are. We're going to talk about Francis Eginton, an 18th century glass painter who in his lifetime had a degree of celebrity. And if I could just go to the next slide, this is some idea of the run through. I'll talk a little bit about Francis Eginton and some contexts about the times in which he was working. The bulk of the talk will be to do with Eginton's work, and hopefully we have some pictures there for you. Towards the end, I will provide some extra context with details of some other notable Georgian glass painters, and that will include some glass painters where there are pieces in the Stained Glass Museum. And then finally, I think a bit of a summing up. The illuminated canvas, was it in fact just a failed experiment? And by the way, the small image you're looking at is some heraldic painted glass for the Russian royal family, and that's in Merton College, Oxford, when some members of the royal family visited Oxford in the 18th century. The college very quickly decided that it should have some painted glass on show for them with their arms. So here we go. And the first thing I thought is that you would like to see what Francis Eginton looked like. Fairly ordinary looking, reliable chap. This was painted in 1796 when he was becoming established as a glass painter, and that was when it was quite late in his life. Francis didn't start out as a glass painter at all. Nobody really knows where he came from, and he didn't really have any education to speak of. The records first pick him up when he began to work for the industrialist Matthew Boulton, who had just inherited his dad's button and buckle manufactory. And Boulton had aspirations. He expanded into making small toys and personal ornaments, but also had an eye for the main chance. He wanted to produce objets d'art, wonderful pieces for the aristocrats and the elite. He began to design silverware, silver plate, invented ormolu, did a large number of engravings, and Francis Eginton was a very important part of Boulton's backup team. Eginton was very versatile. He went from a buckle and button manufactory to someone who could carry out engravings. He could produce Japanware. He could chase in metal. And in fact, when Boulton tried to sell his wares to aristocrats in London, he could rely on Eginton to produce whatever Boulton said was available. And Boulton discovered that Eginton became so valuable to him that in the end, in order to stop him from being poached by a rival manufacturer, Boulton offered Eginton a partnership in a business making mechanical paintings. These paintings were very novel. They weren't just prints. They reckoned to have the secret of reproducing a painting so that you had the look and texture of the canvas. They sold for about 12 or 15 guineas in the 18th century. Quite expensive, but not as expensive as a real work of art. The next thing I thought you would like to see is where Eginton lived. And this is a picture of Prospect Hill. It's Eginton's home, but also his manufactory. You'll see his house. It was probably built by a Wyatt, and it has two wings. The left-hand wing is slightly longer and is well lit, a number of windows there. I think it was probably used as an exhibition space for Eginton because people used to visit him there to see what he had on display. There are records, in fact, of Lord Nelson and Lady Hamilton visiting him. The other interesting thing about this picture, given the beautiful sky and parkland and trees that is there, is if you look over to the right, look closely, you can see what is in fact a red brick building, and that's the manufactory. If you look a little bit further to the right, just before the tree, I very much hope you can see the outline of a bottle kiln, which of course would have implications for a glass painter. Contexts. The most important thing to remember, I think, is that through Matthew Boulton, Francis Eginton was very well placed to meet scientists, people who could advertise his wares, thinkers, other industrialists and artists. And this is just, I suppose, a flavour of the sort of people he would meet through the Boulton connection. You have got Erasmus Darwin there, grandfather of Charles Darwin, who in fact began to work out a theory of evolution. He just didn't have the proof that his grandson went out to get. You've got Joseph Priestley. There is a link there. Although Joseph Priestley was a scientist who worked in oxygen, he was also a radical Republican. He was very much in favour of the French Revolution and indeed American independence. You've got Josiah Wedgwood, the potter. Josiah Wedgwood's earliest biographers say that Eginton may have helped Wedgwood develop black basalt ware. You've got Angelica Kaufman and Benjamin West there. Both of them permitted Francis Eginton to prepare engravings of their famous contemporary paintings. They saw it as another market to advertise their wares, and they were very pleased with that relationship. The connection with Benjamin West continued when Eginton decided to go into the glass painting business. The other connection there you've got, which is pretty important, is James Wyatt, the architect. Now, Eginton met him through Bolton, again, because the Wyatts built Soho and built mills and mints for Bolton. But the other important thing to note is that Eginton's second wife was a Wyatt. She was the cousin of James Wyatt. And so there you have a family connection, quite important when it came to Eginton getting work. Eginton never joined the celebrity London exhibition scene, but it seems that his connections with these types of people was enough to make sure he got work. A little bit more context, you've got politics, religion, enlightenment, and invention in the 18th century. Now, just a few things here. You've got the steam engine, you've got canals, very important for new goods being made in the Midlands and up north being transported around the country. The people that Eginton associated with were generally in favour of the abolition of slavery, although sometimes to our sensibilities with a degree of ambiguity. You've got the mint there, and the fact that coinage could be reproduced and sent around the country is quite important. You've got, as I mentioned, the American independence situation. What was happening in America was quite important. Also relations with the French. And finally, I've popped in Bonnie Prince Charlie. Please don't forget that the Jacobite rebellion was pretty fresh in people's minds, 1740s into the 1750s, and King George, a staunch Protestant, would have been very worried about Catholic sensibilities there and what was going on. As far as we are looking at cultural practices of illumination, I think this adds to the context. The Georgians were pretty keen on what you could do with light, both scientifically, but also as entertainment. The picture on the top right is of the Ido Fusicon, a terrific entertainment in the Strand. For a shilling, people would be treated to a display of light shone through transparencies of storms and shipwrecks with sound effects. Firework displays were a very big thing. That's an image of one of the Georgian firework displays for George III on the River Thames. Back to science, the other image there is a picture of one of Matthew Bolton's Argand lamps. I wouldn't say he stole the design from Ami Argand, a Frenchman, but he persuaded him to give him information about how to design a lamp that was as bright as between 6 to 10 of the best candles. Now, in Georgian England, that is quite something. Architecture also had an effect on glass painting, and again in the late Georgian period you're going between neoclassicism and into the Gothic revival. Here you have Strawberry Hill, Horace Walpole's great Gothic creation. You have at the bottom right, James Wyatt's Pantheon, designed when he was a very young man. It was a building in London that helped make his name. Industrial buildings were also being created on a large scale, and this is Samuel Wyatt's flour mill in Southwark in London. The other image at the bottom is a church in Birmingham, St. Paul's, and that has a link with the next slide, which is this, and it's our first stained glass window, and I guess it's our first look at an illuminated canvas. It's still in situ, and remember I said that Benjamin West was quite important to Francis Eginton when he parted company with Matthew Boulton and really began glass painting on his own account in a big way. This painting was based on the conversion of St. Paul by Benjamin West. The original is in the Dallas Museum of Art. Eginton borrowed the painting from Benjamin West for the sum of 80 guineas and tried to copy it on glass faithfully. And if you do actually go and see the painting in situ, it is quite dark. The glass is heavily enameled, and there is some evidence that in order to get the technique and the look that Eginton wanted, he used more than one pane of glass, laminated, one pane of glass and then another pane of glass pressed up against one another and then into the putty and then put into the frame. We'll come back to that again, but what it meant is that Eginton had more than one pane of glass, more than two sides to enamel upon, so it meant he had fewer firings. This was quite an important window. It wasn't paid for by anyone wealthy. The trustees of the church had to carry out some fundraising exercises. In fact, they put on a concert with a star performer, a lady called Nancy Storris. I don't know if she is known to any of you, but Nancy Storris was Mozart's first Suzanne in The Marriage of Figaro, and he actually wrote the part for her. And that window cost the trustees of St. Paul's Church in Birmingham something like 400 guineas. And Eginton thought that they got it cheap at the price, but this was fairly early on in his glass painting career. And so he thought he'd let them have it as a bit of a loss leader. This is another example of Eginton's glass painting. It probably deserves a session on its own account. You're looking at the Last Judgment in Magdalen College Chapel in Oxford. It's huge. It was renovated in the 1990s by Chapel Studio. It's painted entirely in sepia tones. The window has an interesting history. The first iteration was by Greenbury in the 17th century, destroyed in a storm. The college, after a lot of toing and froing, decided to ask Eginton, with his scientific methods, to repair Greenbury's painting, and in the end Eginton effectively recreated the window and repainted it himself. If you look closely, I think you can see that the style is very much 18th and not 17th century. It's also a very interesting 18th century realization of Michelangelo's Last Judgment. If you look at the image on the right and the trumpet being blown, if you remember Michelangelo's version, that trumpeter has great open bulging eyes and really blown out cheeks. There is effort in Michelangelo's Last Judgment. There's a great deal of religious ferocity there. This is a much gentler, kinder trumpeting. It's quite marked, the difference from Michelangelo. We really don't know what Greenbury's version of this Last Judgment looked like, but there you go. Again, this is in situ. If you're lucky enough to go to Magdalen College Chapel, you can see it there. This is another lovely piece from St Alkmund in Shrewsbury, and recently Holywell Glass undertook some amazing conservation work there. Moving across on the left-hand side, you will see that the painting was based on the Assumption of the Virgin by the 16th century Guido Reni. Now, it's clearly a Catholic painting with the Virgin there, but what Eginton did quite cleverly for St Alkmund's is he repurposed the design. So he kept the figure and the face, but he changed the iconography. So he called this Faith. And you will also see that a lot of the Marian blue has gone missing, but there's a little bit there in her sash. There is a close-up of Eginton's face. I think these are pre-conservation photographs. And again, you begin to see some of Eginton's technique. A lot of the complexion on the face was done by stippling rather than painting in terms of brushstroke. And again, for the face, you have this lamination, 2 pieces of glass embedded into the putty, and it gave Eginton therefore 4 sides to build up his diffusing wash at the back, so that he had a sort of a canvas to work on, and then enameling on the other 3 sides to produce the painting effects that he wanted. Eginton again charged St Alkmund's in Shrewsbury about 400 guineas for this work, which is on an architectural scale. I've done a little bit of light measuring, and if anyone is interested, each individual pane of glass in the glazing, between the glazing grid, is about 46 centimeters tall. So if you're good at counting, you can perhaps begin to work out how big that picture is. Faith, of course, is another one of the 7 virtues, and she was in the scheme that was very popular at the time. Joshua Reynolds designed a series of 7 virtues for his friend Thomas Gervase, and he painted those for New College Chapel in Oxford. This building was by James Wyatt. It's Brocklesby Park Mausoleum. Pevsner decided that, in his opinion, this was Wyatt's masterpiece. It was a memorial for Sophia and had a statue in the middle of it, a memorial by Joseph Nollekens, the great sculptor. The exterior of the chapel is top right. Top left is an image, the best one I could find, of the painted dome. And the most interesting thing about this is the effect of the yellow glass. It has cherub seraphim all around the outside looking down on Sophia, and the yellow glass gives her a suitably muted atmosphere. The mausoleum was very modern. Inside there is a plaque signifying that it was a building that had a lightning conductor, and it was a lightning conductor built to Benjamin Franklin's specifications, a very modern thing to have. The bottom right picture, I couldn't resist this. Some of you may recognize in a harness, but without a safety helmet, the distinguished stained glass craftsman, Peter Campling from Chapel Studio, with his Henry Hoover behind him. Peter, a few years ago, undertook some checks on the glass dome. I'm told, given its age, it's actually wearing very well. The nicest thing I think about the picture of Peter is the ladder that he's standing on. The ladder was another technological marvel. It was built for the dome and is contemporary with the dome, and it's still doing good service there for people to access it. I wasn't able to get the license, and I'm sorry for tonight, for the painting that Turner, J.M.W. Turner, did of the dome and the glass from the interior. He was very, very taken with the way in which yellow light was diffused through glass, or indeed the way in which light was diffused through yellow painted glass. And in one of his lectures to the Royal Academy when he was Professor of Painting, he used that painting of the dome as a teaching aid for his students. There is some thought that Turner was so taken with the effect that Eginton produced of light through yellow painted glass that Turner sought to replicate some of this in his own oil painting work. I think that probably needs to be thought through in some ways, but it's a very, I suppose, interesting thought, isn't it, that a canvas painter would take inspiration from a glass painter. I should say that putting this set of slides together for tonight has reminded me just how much detective work we needed to do to try and identify where Eginton's glass paintings are. He didn't leave any commission books or account books. We get a lot of material through looking at Matthew Bolton's papers, letters from Matthew Bolton to and from Eginton may mention paintings in passing. If you go to great country houses or churches, you may find a few references in account books or letters there. Certainly Oxford College records are quite useful. We have therefore come across this face. It's Letitia Weirden. She's in St. Peter and St. Paul's Church in Aston in a crate. And there are very few photographs of her because the people in Aston simply won't open the crate up. She's in a very fragile state. I think Holywell Glass Conservation Studios may have been lucky enough to have a look at her a few years ago. Miss Weirden died quite young, and her elder married sister decided to have a window made and dedicated to her memory. Miss Weirden here wasn't very well looked after and was moved around the church and then finally removed altogether. It seems that the Victorians didn't think much of her. In the complete picture, which you can't see, you'll just have to believe me, she is actually rising from her tomb and going up to heaven. I think that the Victorians would be quite troubled in such a context with all of this flowing hair and indeed quite a low-cut shift. I think, to be honest, they thought she was a bit risque and certainly not suitable for an image of a maiden and death, which is why she got removed from the church and is unloved. However, there is a degree of sensitivity in the way in which her face has been painted. I think the church would very much like to have some work done on her. They would love to find somewhere to put her, but it's going to cost too much for them at the moment. This would be quite a fundraising exercise for them. Quite recently, in fact, only the other week, I was lucky enough to be allowed into Wardour Castle Chapel in Wiltshire, and the architect here was John Soane, and Francis Eginton was retained to do a couple of window treatments. First of all, in the sanctuary, you will see he was asked to paint a lunette, and that's in the top right. Again, you will see that there is an element of coloured light, yellow light coming through clouds with a kind of a rainbow treatment around the edge of the top of the lunette. And I'm not sure how successful that is, but that is in stained or coloured glass. I'm sometimes quite taken with the thought that the Georgians, many of the Georgians, did know how to make and use coloured glass, but they just chose not to, whether it was the fashion or whether it was because coloured stained glass was still too closely linked to Catholicism and the Catholics. I think might be something to think about. The Protestants wanted something new and quite different in their churches to begin with. The little picture at the bottom again is a mix of painted glass. So again, you have glass with a diffusing backwash to make a canvas of it, and the little roundels are painted on, but there are coloured glass quarries as well there. It is interesting to note that although I just spoke there about this mix of stained glass and painted glass, of course, with Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill, he was extraordinarily keen to cherish stained glass and collected it from all over the world. And at Strawberry Hill, with his Gothic fantasy, he was perhaps an early proponent of looking to see how painted glass could be incorporated into architecture and decoration again. I wondered if you would like to see something of a rarity. I found this on Facebook, and it reckons to be in an antiques emporium in North America. And another photograph definitely shows F. Eginton's imprint, 1802. It sort of looks right, the date is right. I think someone's got a light box behind it for the purpose of this image. There is a sister piece. It's perhaps neoclassical in its style. I don't know much about it, but if anyone ever fancies a trip to North America to A.F. Broch Antiques, I have more details, and I'd love to know what's going on. I think the face is very 18th century there. The profile is quite cute, and you have some interesting bisque flesh tones there. I suspect she's a muse and may have been a roundel in that went on top of a much bigger architectural glass piece. Forgive me, I've gone too far. If you would just bear with me, I'm guessing this is one of those comedy moments where the person actually giving the talk has skipped her slides. Let's see if we can get you back to where I want you. Please bear with me.
Just click from current slide at the top there, Suzanne. You've selected that one, it should go back.
There we go. Thank you very much, Jasmine. I thought you might like to see another aspect of glass painting, which is heraldic glass. Stained glass and painted glass has always, I think, been used very much to advertise or to announce identity and status, and this was no less so for the Georgians. And these are some designs worked up by Francis Eginton's son, who was also in the business at Prospect Hill. The middle one is for the Duke of Buckingham. It's a design that's in the V&A, but the window is lost. The other two pieces are heraldic designs for William Beckford's great Gothic folly, built by Wyatt. And William Beckford, although his dad was Lord Mayor of London, he was very keen to try and find his place in the world and to try and, I think, convince himself as much as anything that he was linked to royalty, linked to great people from the past. He did this to enhance his status, but I think also have something to do with his sense of self in the world. Beckford actually retained a member of the College of Heralds. He paid for one of the heralds, to work full-time on his family tree and work up coats of arms. It was then left for the Egintons to come up with designs for stained glass. It was an immense piece of work. The commission for stained glass at Fonthill was possibly the biggest commission in England at the time. John Hardman said that he thought the Egintons made something like £12,000 out of it in Georgian money, which is a terrific amount. And the Egintons produced a great quantity of heraldic glass, but also images of kings and saints throughout the building. Most of it was destroyed when Fonthill fell down, I suppose, for want of a better word, because James Wyatt was not at his best when he was building Fonthill. He was drinking heavily by then. He had quite a difficult client who made all sorts of demands and changes for the design, and it was not a good marriage. Beckford and Wyatt, and the building was destroyed within a matter of years, and Beckford simply moved somewhere else. Eginton, I've done it again. I will have to go back and there we go. Eginton again, just to remind you what he looked like. He died in 1805. His son and son-in-law attempted to continue with the Prospect Hill glass painting manufactory and studio for about 20 years more, if that. Matthew Bolton famously said that Eginton earned more money than he could possibly spend painting glass. It's a great shame, therefore, that he died in debt. and his family continued with the glass painting to fulfill unfinished commissions and also to try and get the family out of debt. It wasn't a very happy ending. It's also the case, of course, that glass painting was falling out of fashion. The architects and indeed the artists were looking much more closely at glass that was like medieval glass. The Gothic revival was coming in. Classicism was dying as an architectural style. Early English and the Gothic revival was the way to go forward. William Raphael Eginton had some success with that. He was able to produce coloured glass, and so he did go into that market a little bit. He became glass stainer to Princess Charlotte and was a member of the Scottish Society of Antiquaries, and so got some business in Scotland as well. But by the time William Raphael Eginton died in the 1830s, there was really no call whatsoever for painted glass on an illuminated canvas. I will try and move the screen on without causing too much trouble this time, and here we go. I said that I would, just for context, mention some other notable Georgian glass painters. There were many others besides Francis Eginton, and some of them had a degree of celebrity. And when I do this very, very quickly, I will also reference some pieces in the Stained Glass Museum. It's part of the Stained Glass Museum's acquisition policy, I think, to keep an eye out for notable 18th century painted glass. And I can show you some that they have already. This one is lovely. It's sort of 1820, 1830, so you're at the very end of the Georgian period, but it is painted on glass, and it's St. Paul preaching after Raphael, one of the cartoons in the V&A. And it's believed to be by a student of William Collins in London. We think it might be Muss, but no one is ever very sure. Again, I don't have an image of this, but there is a link if you want to look it up later. This is a fairly small panel, but at the Stained Glass Museum, you can get up close and have a look at the detail. Now, at Stour Head in Wiltshire, in a National Trust property, go and have a look in the library, because Francis Eginton in the late 1780s painted the School of Athens on an architectural scale. It's huge. It's recently been conserved by Holywell Glass. And if you have a look at this one in the Stained Glass Museum and then go and have a look at what's Stour Head, you can look at two Georgian treatments of Raphael. And that's quite a fun thing to do. I'm told again that at Stour Head, Eginton used two pieces of glass laminated together so that he had four surfaces to paint on. And there is a lot of quite sensitive stippling technique, using the brush to stipple rather than as the brush to sweep the enamel colour across. This is another gem, and it's in the Stained Glass Museum on display, and it's on an architectural scale. It's by James Pearson, and it's of King George III. It's a copy of Joshua Reynolds. And Jasmine may want to add a bit more to this. It's really quite wonderful. Again, at the Stained Glass Museum, you can get up close and see how the enamel paint was applied to the glass, which is a a real treat, and it was in Windsor Castle, I believe, and above a chimney breast. How did that work, you may think? I understand from Jasmine that there were holders behind it so that candles could be put behind. So you have a nice coming together there of candle power and the illuminated canvas. James Pearson actually tried to get the business from Beckford for Fonthill. If you remember, I said that it was the biggest glass painting commission in England at the time. James Pearson tried very, very, very hard to get the business from Beckford. He wasn't successful. When he was asked how much individual figures or individual pieces would cost, Pearson quoted between 60 and 80 guineas, and Eginton quoted between 40 and 60 guineas. Beckford only wanted the best. He only ever used the best craftsmen and artists, and it says something about Eginton's skills for the time, that even though he was cheaper, he was deemed to have similar skills to the Pearsons. But again, this is a treat. If you go to the Stained Glass Museum, get up close and have a look at how the Georgian glass painters worked their glass canvas. This is not in the Stained Glass Museum, but I pop it up and I'll try to bring together a number of threads here. This is by Eglinton Margaret Pearson, the aristocratically connected Eglinton Margaret Pearson, who was James Pearson's husband. This is her copy. It's a small panel, and it's l'Aurora, after a fresco by the 17th century Guido Reni. Again, you'll remember, I hope, that Guido Reni provided the subject matter for Faith at St Alkmund's in Shrewsbury. This is in the Corning Museum of Glass in America. It's recently undergone some conservation work and it's on display there. Eglinton Margaret worked with her husband on some of the architectural size commissions that they had, but she was really noted as a fine painter of panels in her own right, and was exhibited as a glass painter at the Royal Academy. I haven't seen this in person. This is a photograph of the panel when it's backlit, so I think you can really see sun coming up with dawn there. Again, yellow light through the glass. There's quite an interesting connection. On the very opening slide, you saw an image of one of the seven virtues, and I thought I would mention this very, very quickly. I think I still have a few more minutes. The famous painter Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy of Art, designed 7 virtues for his friend Thomas Gervais for New College, Oxford, as I've mentioned. The virtues were faith, hope, charity, justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. The image on the left is the Reynolds design in the Ashmolean. The central image is Gervais's realization on painted glass of charity, and it's still in situ with the other 6 virtues in New College, Oxford Chapel. Now, Horace Walpole thought very little of this glass. In fact, a number of people hated Gervais's rendering of the virtues, and Walpole dismissed them as the washy virtues. I have seen some art historians and stained glass specialists say that they're not really washy at all. They are very sensitively realized. And I think if you can look at them close up, again, Gervais uses a very subtle stippling technique. However, I think as Georgian glass painters moved on, and because the designs were so popular, they wanted to get rid of the washiness. And on the far right, you have William Raphael Eginton's version of Charity. And I don't think she's very washy at all. I think those colours are striking. And again, you can see that in Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery if you want. The virtues were a very popular subject for painted glass windows in this period, the late 18th and the early 19th century. And I have put a reference to a piece in Vidimus, because the Barley Studio at York were tasked, I think is the right word, with reconstructing a version of Charity, which I think was originally painted by William Collins, for the Johnstone Museum. And so there's now Charity on halfway up a stairwell, I think, in the Johnstone Museum. You will see that it is, you can recognize the design, but again, I think there may be a story there, and possibly another webinar out of the virtues and indeed what Barley Studio got up to there. I'm almost done, everyone, and I thought I would go back to the Stained Glass Museum and show you this. This is a tiny but exquisite little painted panel, not yet on display at the Stained Glass Museum, but I think that will be a pleasure to come. It's by William Peckett of York, one of the earliest glass painters. It's absolutely lovely. It's a pampered pet on a velvet cushion with gold tassels and braiding. I think it's a slightly overweight pooch, but it sort of has a look of loyalty in its yellow eyes. You can check it out online on the Stained Glass Museum website, but I think the curator Jasmine may well confirm that she's going to get that on display when she can, but it's tiny, it's exquisite. So to sum up, the illuminated canvas, was it a failed experiment? The cons are that some people say there was very limited understanding of glass and light. Why did you render a window opaque to begin with it? To begin with, what was the point? I think that some glass painters were battling with poor technique and materials, and Eginton, with his links to Bolton and his technologists, scientists and industrialists, may have helped there. The plus, however, is I think that there was a degree of willingness to engage with technological innovation and ingenuity. These were new, these were amazing things. You could have a painted glass window in your church or in your mansion or your castle or your cathedral. I think it might also be an example of the Georgian fad for prints and reproductions. It's another example of the image multiplied, and what's more, in a different medium. The Georgians were crazy for that kind of thing. And then finally, I suppose this is a historian's point, which is whatever you think about is aesthetically. As a historian, it simply forms a vital part of the continuum of the story of stained glass, and therefore ought to be cherished because of that. And everyone, thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now, if that's possible. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Suzanne. This is where we all would normally clap if we were in a room, and I'm sure people are clapping from home. Thank you so much for kicking off our series with such a high caliber talk we had the historical context, the technological understanding, and I think we've all learnt a lot more about Eginton, and I will be more confident in how I say his name now, Eginton.
And there's a story to that. Some people do say Eginton, and I see from the chat myself, now I have access to it, that Sarah Bayliss is in the house. That is amazing, Sarah. I've wanted to meet you. I know this is virtual, but I've wanted to meet you for a long time. So fantastic, thank you.
And I echo that, as I have said to Sarah. Sarah Bayliss is the pioneer, really, researching Georgian glass painting in the UK. So we're delighted that she's actually popped up today, and I hope that Suzanne and myself can meet her and invite her over to the museum, because she may not have been for a while.
Yes.
So we have some questions, Suzanne, and as is usual, my host writes, I'm going to kick off with one from myself while I then just check the questions in the Q&A. And my question is actually about the copies. So many of these glass paintings in this era are copies of oil paintings or other artists' designs. And in our 21st century world of copyright, it always seems quite surprising.
Yes.
Some of the artists seem to know each other and have kind of formed that relationship. But was it ever contentious? Was it just part of the art world? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. Of course, you've got William Hogarth getting the Engravers Act through in the 18th century, but that was really trying to regulate print media and to prevent rip-offs. The Copyright Act itself didn't come till much later, into the Victorian period. So as far as this kind of thing was concerned, it was a free-for-all. But the glass artists we've looked at were at the top of their game, and they had the connections. Eginton could go to Benjamin West, flatter him, and would be allowed to copy something. As far as something like The Last Judgment or Agueda Rainey was concerned, it's unlikely that they would have seen the original, but they would have gone to people who copied the original, who were out on a grand tour, and they would have flattered, paid, and got, I suppose, in modern parlance, the rights to use the image. I think most Georgians, like Benjamin West, like Reynolds, in fact, really saw advantages to having their work copied and disseminated to a growing population. It was no longer a case of an aristocratic person having a picture in their home for their friends or themselves to ponder over. The aspiring middle classes, working classes wanted a piece of the action. They wanted this culture, and the artists of the day were very happy to oblige. I think print media was slightly different. That was a bit of a Wild West until Hogarth worked out how much money he was losing with rip-offs. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, a few questions in the chat. One is, are there any photos of the mechanical paintings? They sound intriguing. And I think that's the mechanical paintings that you mentioned earlier on.
Yeah,